Yes, good evening and welcome to the third workshop here within Platform Ukraine. For those who can't read my little name thingy here, my name is Fieldwork. I'm a research associate in the Entipole project here at UCLC, and I will be chairing this wonderful event. Today we are going to discuss the question of research methodology and fieldwork in the post-socialist environment. We have three wonderful speakers. Apologies for Dr. Taviton Harris, who could not come. First off, we have Dr. Jana Schostek, who's a Mellon postdoctoral fellow here at UCLC. We have Dr. Anna Pachurina. I got it right the first time there. From Leeds Beckett University, and we have Rob Stoddart, an award-winning photographer who's going to talk about his experiences and practice. And I control this event will run this way, that we first have three presentations, around 15 minutes each, and we'll start to discuss. In this series, what's very welcome is your contributions. If you want to share experiences, we can discuss it more in the group. If you have questions, raise your hand in the chat. But we'll start with Joanna, who will be talking about dealing with distrust, some lessons from political fieldwork in Moscow, Minsk, and Kiev.
Can I ask before we start, can you give me a 5-minute warning just in case I start waffling? Very helpful.
Okay.
Yes. I don't think I'm going to But yes, I said that I would talk about distrust, the problem of distrust, and the difficulties that it's posed for me in my own research and the ways that I've tried to deal with it. I don't want to pretend to be a massive expert on dealing with distrust. I have in total about 5 years' experience conducting fieldwork in post-Soviet context, which is spread over 2 projects. The first was my doctoral project, which I interviewed about 50 journalists and other media industry professionals in Kiev, Minsk, and Moscow. That was in 2010 to 2012. And the second project is my current postdoctoral project, for which I have surveyed and interviewed university students in Moscow. And I did the fieldwork for that in September and October of this year, so it was only about 7 weeks ago. But issues of distrust definitely affected both these projects in various ways. So I'll use the 50 minutes to share with you some concrete examples of problems that I encountered and how I responded to them. And hopefully that will provide a good basis for discussion. I'll begin with some of my recent experiences in Moscow, and then I'll go on later to talk about the interviews that I did in Kiev and Minsk a few years ago. So I want to start by sharing with you an email which I received in September, which I think is a rather striking example of what distrust looks like on paper. So the background to this email is that I was trying to set up a survey of second-year undergraduate students at the High School of Economics in Moscow, which is one of Russia's more international and more liberal universities. In order to make the survey work, I needed to get a random and representative sample of second years to take part in it. And my plan was to conduct the sampling frame by getting a list of all the teachers who taught English to second years, because English is a compulsory subject at HSE. So if you randomly sample from the list of English teachers, and then the sample teachers distribute the questionnaires to their groups, you end up with quite a nice random cluster sample of respondents. So I contacted first the heads of the 3 English departments at HSE, and they all gave me permission to write to their teachers, and I wrote to my random sample of teachers, and most of them expressed willingness to help, except one, who sent me the following email, which I've translated into English for the purposes of this talk. So she wrote, "It so happens that I am a specialist in the area of psycholinguistics, and I know rather a lot about neurolinguistic programming and manipulating the subconscious. In this regard, some of the questions in your survey are inappropriate and incompetently formulated. Clear anti-Russian undertones can be clearly seen in the questionnaire. In my view, that is completely unacceptable." So she went on, "In your list of media, you ask the students to refer to resources like Dozhd, Slon, Snob, Echo Moskvy, Nova Gazeta, and others of dubious reputation that are regretfully infamous for their openly anti-state and anti-Russian position. At the same time, many reputable and trustworthy media sources were not mentioned. If you think the students are reading Snob and Slon, why might not they also be reading the websites of Chechen terrorists, for example, or Al Jazeera? So what she was actually referring to in that email was a list. One of the questions I was asking, trying to find out which media the students were using, and I've listed about 50, which included all, sort of Первый канал, all the state media, as well as, Echo Moskwy and the more opposition ones. And the students were asked to circle the ones they'd used in the past month. But unfortunately, this lady thought that just by mentioning Echo Moskwy and Novaya Gazeta and the like could be a very dangerous influence on vulnerable students' minds. So what do you do when you get an email like that? Personally, I wrote back. I tried to explain that, in fact, I was not in the least anti-Russian. I'd spent over 6 years of my life living in Moscow and was extremely fond of the place. And my sole aim was to understand the processes that were going on in Russian society. I explained my methods and why I decided to survey the way that I had. Unfortunately, she was not having any of it, so I got a second email which said, I strongly recommend that you study the Russian media landscape so that in the future there will be no misunderstandings with what you call media of an opposition nature. Of course, these sources have the right to exist. We have a free country. But let's admit that they are read and watched by an absolute minority of Russians. So when you mention them and ignore really popular publications and TV channels, it is a clear manipulation of young people's minds who suffer from youthful maximalism and don't have a settled point of view. To use such methods on adults would be unacceptable, but on teenagers it's completely outrageous. And then her concluding words to me were perhaps the most alarming. She said, there have been instances where foreign organizations try to get information under the excuse of conducting scientific or sociological research, which is against Article 18.8 of the Russian Administrative Code. If you don't want your activity in our country to prompt such reproaches, be more careful in formulating your research materials. So you can sort of hear a bit of a threat in there, I think. So there you have a very concrete and recent example of how distrust can manifest itself when conducting research in contemporary Russia. So what are the consequences of this kind of distrust, and what can you do about them? The first consequence I'd like to highlight is actually the emotional reaction that it provokes. I mean, now, 2 months later, and back in London, I can share this email with you, and perhaps you can smile about it and sort of think how ridiculous it seems. But I have to say, at the time, I did take it quite personally, and it made me very uncomfortable, because she was essentially questioning my integrity as a researcher. And as for that last bit about violating the Russian Administrative Code, and beware of prompting reproaches, for a moment now I was thinking, oh gosh, what if the FSB comes and tries to take my precious surveys that I need for my research, which I think was completely far-fetched now, because I think the FSB has bigger fish to fry. But at the time the whole thing was very stressful. And in terms of what you can do about that, I think the answer is probably to develop thick skin. I think at the moment we have to recognize that when we're studying anything to do with Ukrainian and Russian politics, at the moment you're never going to be able to please everyone. You have to expect that you will get some negative reactions, and they might be offensive, and you have to emotionally be prepared for that. The second consequence, of course, of this kind of distrust is the effect on the results of your research. In the case of this particular email, the lady, unsurprisingly, refused to distribute my questionnaires to her students. So this in itself wasn't a massive disaster, because I'd asked about 5 teachers from her department to distribute the questionnaires, and 3 of them did still cooperate. So I had a reasonable response, and I should be able to weight the survey responses so that the sample is still proportionally representative. But unfortunately, this lady did talk to her friends, and 1 or 2 of them then refused to help me. So my sample is short about 30 students that might otherwise have been in the sample. So what can you do about it if distrust stops you getting the access that you need? In some cases, not a lot, but there are certain things I think which can help to prevent the problem arising. So one interesting thing that I noticed was that there was a lady who was CC'd on this correspondence, and she sort of seen all this stuff about manipulating the students' minds, but despite that she still did agree to distribute the questionnaires. And the reason that she gave for that is that she was satisfied that the head of department had vouched for me, Because before the very first sort of stage when I was setting up this survey, I'd approached the heads of department and said, can you please send a message to your subordinate staff and explain who I am, explain what I'm doing. And for the colleague of this lady, that was enough. That I was working through official channels. I was not trying to sort of covertly go in and get information. And I think that does, this particular instance underlines the benefits of going through official channels rather than, through your own sort of networks. I think it can be very, very helpful. And in terms of, making friends with the bosses, I spent 2 hours having tea and a chat with the head of the English department. And I think through that sort of actually making the effort to, speak to her and explain what I was doing, that was also sort of helped to reduce the level of distrust amongst the other English teachers. And I mean, I've been making a big thing of this one lady and her one email, but the fact is that I approached over 30 teachers, and it was only that one case where I got such a negative reaction. And the only other perhaps thing to mention is that sometimes you can tailor your research questions so that they are within the scope of the feasible. Because my survey, I was working at High School of Economics, which is known to be one of the sort of more open institutions in Moscow. At one stage, I was hoping to perhaps do a similar survey somewhere like the Bauman Institute. I think it would have been interesting, but at the end of the day, it would never have got off the ground, I think, because they're much more closed institutions. So I don't think my results are any less interesting from the fact that they're from a liberal institution. It's just that I'm answering certain questions and leaving other questions unanswered. So especially I think if you're in a sort of position of being a doctoral student or a postdoc like me, your resources aren't infinite. Perhaps you do have to think, what is feasible, what is realistic, and shape your questions accordingly. How long have I got left? So moving on from the sort of recent experience in Moscow, which was only sort of 2 months ago, going back to 2010 and 2012, which is when I was doing my interviews in Minsk and Kiev. So for that research project, I had to persuade journalists and editors from specific media to talk to me about the factors that affected their reporting of Russia. And thankfully, for the most part, I found that distrust wasn't a major problem in either Ukraine or Belarus, surprisingly perhaps. Because I think journalists tend to be the kind of people who like talking about politics, they have opinions, and in a lot of cases I was able to just cold call and the people I needed, and they said yes, and what seemed to be a fairly, so we seemed to have a fairly open conversation as a result of just cold calling them and getting in touch. I was quite surprised that I got such a sort of open reception in Minsk, because I'd previously spent months in Moscow calling up the big Russian federal channels and asking for an interview, and it was a brick wall every time. Whereas when I called the state channels in Minsk, they were like, da, конечно, yes, of course. And some of them even came to meet me at the metro, which is not what you expect when you go to the last dictatorship in Europe or whatever people call it. But I think the explanation for that, as I look at it, is twofold. I think first is that nobody within the Belarusian regime even pretends that their state media are impartial. So Lukashenko said openly on multiple occasions that the state media should support him and his ideology. So they're not particularly defensive about it. Whereas in Russia, they still try to maintain the sort of line that their media are impartial, and therefore they're sort of more defensive about talking about things like that. So, and the second reason I think why things went relatively well in Minsk is that I was primarily interested in their coverage of Russia and international affairs, which is I think a much less sensitive issue than their coverage of domestic issues. So I think when you go to Belarus, the closer your questions touch on Lukashenko, the more trouble you're going to have, basically. There were isolated instances of distrust that did affect my work, but perhaps those cases were actually less to do with distrust and more to do with people having something to hide or something they didn't want to sort of confess to. because the problems mainly concerned a couple of the Belarusian and Ukrainian editions of Russian newspapers, and the editors and journalists I spoke to weren't entirely comfortable with sort of sharing full information on the nature of their relationship with the Moscow editorial office. And there was one case in particular where the person I interviewed was most definitely giving me inaccurate information. He was saying that the paper always adapted content from Moscow for the Ukrainian audience. They didn't just publish verbatim content from the Moscow edition. And I knew that was untrue because I had spent 2 horrible months reading umpteen copies of his wretched newspaper, and so I knew what was in his newspaper and I knew what he was telling me was not true. So in that kind of case, when you're being fed false information, really I think the only answer is to try to look for alternative methods, alternative sources that you can use to verify what you're being told. Which in my case, in that instance, was content analysis. I did content analysis, which made it then easier to do the interviews and sort of weigh up what I was being told. But there are other ways. I mean, it's called triangulation, basically. Another sort of approach that I used was to ask, if I was interviewing journalists from one TV channel, I wouldn't just ask them about the work of their own TV channel, I would also ask them about the work of rival TV channels. And they might not know so much about the rival TV channels, but they might be a whole lot more willing to talk about what their rivals are doing as opposed to what they're doing themselves. And again, that has its own issues because obviously, you need to take information with a piece of salt sometimes, pinch of salt sometimes, but it can sort of point you in the right direction and give you, an extra insight that you might not otherwise get. So I think that's all for me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'm doing it in a bit scholarly way with a PowerPoint presentation. Right, I also get carried away, so I need to start.
Okay, I can also give you that.
So let's start. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today during this busy and pre-Christmas time to discuss fieldwork in Russia. And as you can see, I will be talking about some issues related to studying one's own community. And before I proceed, I just would like to talk a little bit about my own work and research, and which perhaps prevents some questions, but maybe will provoke some other questions. So I'm based here in England, and my research is mainly concerned with understanding Russian identity, culture in that diasporic sense. So I studied how Russian sense of belonging or home is represented through their everyday life and perhaps through material artifacts or through the practices of using these material artifacts. So which means that my research is primarily ethnographic. I use visual and sensory methods in my PhD, which I conducted a couple of years ago. I interviewed Russian migrants in their homes, and I did reflect on it on ethics and positionality in the article which was published earlier this year. But I've also been involved, I do have research experience back in Russia, and I'm involved in this consulting work on survey methodology in Russia from here now. And I lecture research methods for the last 4 years, and I'm also in charge of the ethics with our department and at my previous university as well. This doesn't make me a better or worse expert in Russia, but what I just want to say is that I'm going to present some sort of, first of all, I'm involved in discussions on research methods and ethics on an ongoing basis. And secondly, I will be presenting some sort of overview which I've been doing as a sociologist. So it's not just drawing on my own work really, but on the work of my colleagues. So I'm kind of covering different examples and maybe good or bad cases. And I'm going to go and present some, let's say, issues and tips that you might find useful. It's a shame that my colleague Bethany Harris can't be here, because when we were thinking about presenting our studies, she could probably provides an outsider perspective, and I would provide the perspective of the so-called insider, so somebody who was born in Russia like me and who is going to conduct the study in Russia. Why do I think that it will be useful and interesting for the audience in here? And the main point is that I do believe, or I argue, that when one wants to conduct a research in Russia, the position of the insider can never be achieved. So basically, I mean, even if you do achieve, if I'm coming as a Russian person, if I do manage to achieve something that I would vaguely call an insider position, it will not last, and it's kind of situational. It is changing, and I do not control it. So for this reason, it makes it easier. So no one is an insider in Russia. I mean, no one who wants to conduct a sociological research. And you can see this picture. It's not really a test, but I don't know. You decide if you're insider, if you can read it first, maybe, and then if you can understand what it means. The second stage of the test. So why do I think so? Firstly, Russia is a challenging environment. It is a rapidly changing environment, but it's also a highly reflexive society. So people do reflect a lot on who they are. And by giving certain answers, or by opening certain doors, we know why they're doing it, and sometimes they do it for a certain reason, to maybe justify their position or because of their status, which dictates certain type of behavior. But then they would always say why. For example, I was in Edinburgh last week, and we discussed this situation. Would you interview somebody who is very politicized figure or somebody who you disagree with, and if you represent an opposition, and the person would say yes, the answer is yes, and I know why I should say yes, but it doesn't mean that I believe that it's yes. So they always reflect on it, they keep explaining themselves, and that's why it makes it difficult to establish any sort of stability. There are other important dimensions that can prevent or influence your positionality, and I put question marks because this is all contested, obviously, but I think they come into play sometimes, and as I said, it can be established on one basis. For example, generation Soviet, post-Soviet, I can come as somebody who was born in the Soviet Union, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we can speak the same language with these people. Then class as well, social discrepancy, high financial status, lower cultural capital, and the other way around, and we will see how much financial capital people will have in a couple of months, given the situation. So once again, gender is always there, and it doesn't matter if you would take it as something that will help you, and you would take it as something that you could manipulate your respondents with, it still will be always there. It will always affect any fieldwork you'll be doing, especially in combination with the generation or /age. Ethnicity, at the moment in Russia, it's all quite difficult, and what the case of Ukraine shows how quickly and it can change, and how controversial and politicized it can be, which again, to me, will be quite difficult now to recruit any Ukrainian in Russia or here. And social geography, I hope you do know the difference between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Novosibirsk is the third city in Russia, but how different it is socially. But then, yeah, okay, we know the difference between Moscow and St. Petersburg, but hey, do you know the difference between Novosibirsk and Kemerovo and Tomsk? These are all quite different as well, and this is just we always have to take in mind. And by this I mean that you would say, okay, if you do qualitative research, if you do something like ethnography, which means that probably situational and feminist social positionality can be optional. I think in the Russian case, it's not an option. It's a requirement to be always reflective and to actually keep changing your position, keep reflecting it, and keep adjusting to the situation at any given moment. Some practical issues. What would work? What usually works for people who work there? Gatekeepers, and actually have different gatekeepers, different entry points, and having different perspectives from these people. It's actually a good idea. It doesn't mean that you will have the full picture, but you probably actually will have contradictory picture, and for Russia is a good sign if you have different perspectives that complement each other but that contradict each other, slightly in conflict, is a good thing. How much information is too much? I personally advocate for being open from the very start. So if everything is changing around you, at least something isn't changing. Talk about your status, your position as a researcher from the very start, and if this is not going to change, you will keep it, and they will adjust to it or they get used to it, but at least you know, if you want to do some sort of covert research and then something happened, it will be much difficult for you to adjust. So if you open everything, who you are, what do you need to do, people will make a decision. Yes, you probably will lose certain participants, but at the same time, it's important to keep formal your formal status. There is something that I call the Russian factor, and I guess a good metaphor for it is that you go somewhere in Russia, some unknown place, you want to check the road, you're prepared everything, you check your Google Maps or you drive around it, your way is good, you know, you wake up next day, you go the same way, it's closed. Why? You don't know. Nobody explains it to you. How long for? You don't know. Who changed that? Is it some Putin directive or is it something roadworks? You just don't know. It just closed for today. And there are things that, like with this example, I really like it, that everything was fine, but just one teacher, one lecturer. And you would never expect where it will come from, but it will come, and it will change your perspective once again. So in this case, just be prepared to sort of some surprises. Ethics forms is a very difficult thing, and they're still not working. I think it's still the case that in Russia one doesn't have to actually go through a formal ethical approval procedure like people do here, and there is a certain element to mistrust to the ethics form of signing up certain forms, but you can get verbal consent, and if you, again, which is why it's important to be open and analyze your position from the very start. If you ask people to sign it and explain it properly, they will probably agree, or at least some sort of verbal consent would do. And some other handy skills, sorry for speaking a bit too fast. What is good to have? I mentioned reflexivity. It is important to take note on what's going on, and cultural sensitivity and sociological awareness, they go hand in hand. You recognize what culture you're dealing with, and you still. I'm a sociologist, that's why I'm talking from this perspective, traditional way of studying, outlining the subject, preparing your research question, your materials, and then. But even if you're in there, you're still aware sociologically what you're exploring. Emotional resistance, I think it's quite important, and you will approach different groups of people. And I didn't mention that. I should have mentioned it earlier when I talked about gatekeepers. Friendship in Russia is still quite valued and demanding type of practice, and in a sense, the more time you spend in the field, it means you'll befriend more people. And the tactic of helping out you as a friend is still quite useful, and but also it can affect the study in an unexpected way, because people will stop thinking about your research, and they won't be interested in what you are doing much, but they will be thinking about helping you as a friend, so helping you to achieve something that you want to achieve. Okay, yeah, whatever you're doing, you're a really good person. What do you need? You know, I'll sign it. You know, I'll answer your interviews. I'll help you. I'll walk you through this. And for this reason, there are people who are just interested in helping out, and they're really good. But at the same time, be aware that sometimes, you know, it can be quite intense in a way. You know, so in terms of ethics here, if you want to translate it into this environment, when we will be signing these forms, we will not be signing them fully informed. So if you're trying to achieve fully informed consent, sometimes it's not going to happen because we would not be actually aware what are we doing and what is it for and how exactly you will be using the identity. Because we could even tell you, yeah, I use my name everywhere because you're such a good person, but it doesn't really mean that we're happy with it, because when we see their name in your research article, you are going to get email or like a phone call. Not everyone will be aware of where exactly it's going. But some people, they do understand the nature of an academic work, and they are actually happy to be not to be anonymized. Visual dimension, and not because I'm a visual sociologist in a way, but I think it is quite helpful in this kind of environments and getting out stories from people and where the amount of visual material. But doesn't matter, would you use it to document something, or would you be talking with people about their own experiences, if they're using their own family albums or photography, because of these very rich biographies that people have in Russia, and we do have so many stories to tell. It is sometimes very difficult to articulate certain kind of experiences, and I think using different range of means, research means, helps to get to that experience and get deeper into details. And finally, I think it's good to keep focus, because when you arrive there and there's so much going on and you want to study everything, I suggest still keep focused and taking out anything that is not really related, because with all that friendships and connections, you will have more than enough already to analyze and to process and to maybe reflect on as well later on. So I hope it was useful, and as I said, I'm thinking more of using this as a starting point for the discussion, and if you want to ask me any questions about any points I mentioned here or any points I haven't mentioned here, I'm more than happy to continue. Thank you.
Much. Use this time to get to know the person who sits next to you, the better. Tell each other where you're from. Our networks, there we go. So no cozying up those.
Okay, so I was asked to come to give you a bit of my practical experience working in Ukraine. I'm not an expert at all in country or politics. Several trips in the last 12 months. agency I work for means we can't have photographers everywhere in the world. Therefore, they rely on people like myself who have more an ability to turn up somewhere and work with a bit of understanding of how you act on the ground without, unfortunately, a lot of the background that a lot of you will have in terms of the political situation. That creates its own problems in terms of how you work, including language, for example, and context, and also how the resulting media coverage is formed. So I thought I'd just take you through chronologically through my times in Ukraine. I'll talk a bit about how it was working there, a little bit about how work I was producing was being contextualised in the media and how it relates to the actual situation on the ground. And I hope that it's interesting for people like yourself to see how the kind of work that I do, which is very in the moment and the nature of the news cycle, very, very rapid in turnaround, how it might be different from the kind of context that you can provide with more in-depth understanding of the situation. So December last year, I arrived with mostly knowledge of my Ukrainian knowledge of politics was to do with this lady, and in many ways drawing parallels between the Orange Revolution and with what's happening in Maidan, for the better or for worse. I arrived and went straight to the press office in Kiev, which was just down the road from there, and said, I'm here, I'm a foreign journalist, I'm here to cover the protests. And they were like, all right. They gave me an orange fluorescent jacket with press and Ukraine on it, but aside from that, it's you're on your own. So it was at that time it was more like a festival. I thought of it as kind of being like it's like a right run-down Christmas market in terms of the weather and the food you were getting. But it was quite difficult visually and things to give a real sense of the politics that was going on, mostly behind the scenes. The way to illustrate what was being said, which I felt was that when it was geopolitical discussion, it was quite hard to do on the ground. So I took pictures of people with interesting hats and sheepskin coats. Started to learn a bit about the people that were involved. There were the people who were there day in, day out. There were the people that would come on the evening and take their pictures by the barricades, but it was all extremely, it was a safe working environment. And I got a little bit tired of that, so I went out to the suburbs, which is intriguing, but it was not really why I was there. And you move on to January, where things have taken, as things did in Ukraine, it seemed like every month there was an escalation of violence in Kiev. So I travel again on assignment, and I'm there to cover basically what's happening in 200 meters of central Kiev. And this is where you end up with the familiar scenes we have, which ended up being quite dramatic, with these makeshift shields of this makeshift against the shields there, I feel, a big symbol of the struggles. But yeah, these dramatic scenes that we saw, which again were not particularly dangerous situations. And I think that's one of these issues I have, which are different to the kind of situation you'll be in. But if I'm producing these images which are going straight out to news outlets, which they can use to enforce certain narratives, I don't have time to. It's not my job to go and say okay, this isn't a dangerous situation. I just go and I say, this is happening here on this street. This is, and then this gets applied to the political situation as news outlets see it. An image like that, for example, you have the European flag and the Ukrainian, is it a crest? These relatable images for people in Europe which show Ukraine having some Christianity, but then there's a discussion of how important that really is in the region. Images like this would be very popular in news outlets, whether they actually have any greater relevance is another question. One thing that troubled me, which again isn't something which I wasn't able to deal with through my line of work, was the obvious far-right symbolism that was in my C18 there. It's not, I know it's not the best picture I've taken, but this is something which I think cannot be really tackled by myself. It's something for people themselves to be able to bring some greater understanding of what far right is in here, what nationalism in Ukraine means, and not let the process be derailed by this kind of thing. Of course, things did get violent, but again, it was very localized, and we were able to work. And access to victims' families, access to funerals was all very simple. But things changed in terms of my working situation in the summer, when the focus upon East before that, but arriving in Donetsk by train, you're in a completely different working environment where you have roadblocks, you have to go and get accredited on this. I think a friend of mine over there, this was the most shocking thing he's ever seen from my work in Ukraine, was I came back with this bit of paper, my Donetsk press pass, and I think that for him and maybe you realise that we're dealing with two distinct working environments. You have Kiev, which was, as things go, reasonably safe working environment, it's manageable working environment. Whereas in Donetsk, which you think you want to be able to travel between the two areas, you're in a completely different situation. And then I think I know you were talking about making the guys at the top feel like they're in charge. That's something which comes into working in this area, where you have to get in with the right general, you have to have the right phone numbers, or else you could be stuck in a checkpoint all day and you won't be able to work. Getting someone to vouch for you, is what you were saying. So I think what I'm saying is that in terms of the imagery here, I think there are a lot of questions that need to be asked. the nature of my work so far has been the answers are usually being given very quickly. But I hope that the combination of imagery and a greater amount of context that can be quite powerful. The situation being a high percent to cover the plane crash when there's a war going on in Donetsk. And perhaps with a little bit of time and money given to these situations, we can do a better job of showing what the bigger picture is. So I just wanted to show how in 6 months, how the situation has changed in both for people on the ground and for the way you have to work. And yeah, I hope it's some interest to you. Completely relevant to your lines of work. That's me.
Thank you all three very much for your presentations and talks. Are there any questions from the floor? There is. Three. Okay. Maybe should we take three altogether and then let you answer them? And maybe we can get the lights on again. Otherwise, I can't really see you.
My name is Andre. I'm finishing my PhD here at CEAS, and I would like to thank all the speakers and the chair for a very interesting workshop. I would like to have one short question to Johanna. I know one general question to all panelists. How do you perceive, what is the reason why Russians are so concerned about the facade democracy, whereas the Belarusians gave up, according to what he said? And my other question for the panel, because all of you have experience with doing research in Russia, Ukraine, and other East European countries, in what extent do you think it's a network state, that you cannot do research without actually having your networks in place and contacts and people you can approach? And how, yeah, I'll stop with that. Thank you.
My name is Mikhail, I'm a CEAS graduate, and my question is, what kind of advice you can give dealing with people with strong beliefs, especially if these beliefs are quite negative toward the West, and there are some ideas. We have heard about an example, and the solution was just not to deal with a particular person who was an obstacle, but sometimes you go for such people with such beliefs to create a picture. So how you would advise to deal with the situation?
Okay, so my name is James Dawson, and I work mostly on the board, so I work across the street at the politics department. So I have a question for Anna and also one for Ron. So Anna, I enjoyed your little reference to ethics forms and how they might not go down too well in certain places in Russia. I've had a similar experience in Serbia, and I'll quickly relate this anecdote. So I was doing focus groups, and I had 4 or 5 people sitting around the table, and my interpretation of the ethics guidelines, this was during my PhD, was that I should get everybody to sign a kind of disclaimer stating their full name and signing that they knew that this would be recorded and would be used in their studies. And of course, it made people incredibly awkward. And I thought about it, and I thought about, okay, there's probably good reasons why these regulations exist, but in practice, not only do they make people feel uncomfortable, but they actually do put them in a slight amount of danger. You know, that there's this tape going around, you know, people are declaring their whole names, And people can do jokes, for example, over what they say. So I decided to reverse the logic. I decided to tell everybody to give me nothing more than their first name, to state that these would be anonymized when it would be transcribed, and please at no point tell me your whole name. And so the question that arises from this is that sometimes the one-size-fits-all kind of ethics regulations don't fit the context. And I wonder if maybe it's okay to bend the rules so long as you can give a good logical rationale for why you do so, and because it's in the interest of the subject of the research. So would you agree with that proposition? And my question for Rob is very simple. So it's wonderful the photography you do. You're very humble talking about, you're in an audience where people deal with Russian culture and Ukrainian culture in great detail, and you don't do that in your work. Now I'm guessing that mostly this is dictated by market forces and things that you don't control. If you could have the choice, would you decide to focus on a theme that could travel across the whole world, for example, to be a war photographer, or to focus on a region, and for this to inform what you're looking for with your lens? And perhaps your health and safety. A lot of journalists face difficult situations in places they've just arrived in.
Okay, now we have 3 specific questions. Maybe we'll do them first, and then we have 2 more generally to the panel. So we just start with Rob. Question: would you rather focus on the theme or the region, given the choice?
So far, my work is broadly focused on themes. I found myself drawn to issues of contested borders and national identity. And that's just a general interest I have, and that's found me. I've worked in Egypt, Israel, recently in Scotland and Ukraine. And I personally like that flexibility it gives me. Yeah, it's whether you're working on specific cultures or whether you're working on specific themes which give a broader understanding. I think that's my personal references to the thing where you can see connectivity between peoples and culture. That's just the best one.
Okay, we'll listen to Joanne. Why have Minsk given up on pretending